Thank you. Okay, awesome. Well, I think most people are here, so I'll just open up the space real quick. To open up the space, I would like to acknowledge the different experiences, passions, and kaupapa everyone is bringing into this space, our different relationships with this land that we're lucky enough to live on and with, and may our shared commitment for a better Aotearoa guide us and keep us focused in this space today. Lovely to see so many people. I'll quickly introduce myself. So, kia ora everyone. My name is Vera. I am German and Ghanaian. I live in the beautiful Te Whanganui Atara. Can't be Wellington on a good day. It's really nice and sunny here. And I'm an OAS campaigner. So I've been planning this OAS Skillshare journey for 2025, 2026. And so if you've been here from the start, so sorry that you had to listen to my introduction again. But if you're here for the first time, welcome. Super glad to have you in this space. And I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as we do. I'm really super excited to have Jess with us here today as well from the workshop. The workshop does an amazing narrative work. I personally have been through some of their upskilling programs as well, and I really enjoyed it. And so if you have a campaign or if you're kind of just starting out, messaging and narratives is, kind of at the core at what we do, of what we do. And so learning from people that do this all the time and being able to ask them questions will hopefully add to your toolkit and hopefully help you on this campaigning journey. Yeah, like Lizzie mentioned, this Skillshare will be recorded. The next one will be recorded as well. I think only the Q&A won't be recorded. That will be kind of a private space for you to ask just questions, but also have that peer support with other campaigners, other activists. And all of the recordings will be available later on our YouTube, which I will share in an email. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Jess to take us through.
Kia ora, thanks Vera. It's lovely to be here. I'm Jess Shaw. I'm tangata Tiriti. I was born, raised on Te Aotearoa land in Te Awa Kārangi, and I live on Te Aotearoa land in Puniki now. I am coming to you from my bedroom. If we're interrupted, it's because I have my younger daughter home from school. So probably that won't happen, but just a little awareness. Um, yeah, it's so nice. Look, Action Station, collaborators and colleagues for a long time, and it's always lovely to be able to share the work that we do. Today and the next couple of sessions are very much just sharing what I know and what we know, but also about learning. It's a reciprocal relationship. So much of what we do and how we've developed the work that we've done at the workshop has been through those relationships with people like yourselves and campaigners and understanding what it is that people need and how the stuff actually gets applied in the wild, so to speak, and what some of the challenges are. So I'm also just really excited to hear from you as well and have some kōrero. The first session today is relatively talky heavy from me and with some activities that Lizzie will put us into breakout rooms for. Uh, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my slide set and get going. Okay. So, awesome. So hopefully you can all see that now. Thumbs up, Vera would be, yeah, awesome. Okay, a little bit about me. It's like I think it's always helpful to know people's story about where they come from and you know who am I to talk into this space. My background, I started my life in public health, working in a regional public health unit actually, and public health has always been a really big part of who I am and what I do. I guess in lots of ways. I've always really been driven by the idea that research and evidence should actually be used to improve all people's lives. And so, all of my career, that's the kind of work that I've done in different spaces. The work that I do at the workshop, I came to after a number of years of talking about facts. Facts are my special interest. I am very big on facts, and I spent a long time talking about good evidence and facts. And As the image kind of says, I just got quite frustrated. It felt like a lot of the time, good evidence, lived experience, just bounced off this kind of invisible force field of decision makers. And at that point, I kind of got curious, wanted to know more, and started my journey on researching and understanding the role of framing really as a kind of core pillar in changing systems, really. And I always think this quote from Linda Tawai Smith, which I came across a lot of years ago, really struck me because I understood that evidence needed compelling stories, but there's something very specific about the way that we tell stories when we have a goal to shift systems and structures. And that's very much around what I'm going to talk about today. So just so you know where we are in the session today is 90 minutes. I'm going to talk about framing and our storytelling minds and storytelling cultures and why that's so important when we're doing change work. I'm going to talk through what does this mean in terms of how we might want to, what we might want to do less of in terms of our storytelling and communicating. I'm going to start in on what we want to embrace by talking about how we can tell our own story and how we can use values framing, particularly, which is core to the work that I do. The next session, the second follow-up session, we're going to talk about a story structure that you can use, and many of you will recognize that story structure. Action Station uses it consistently, and the role of messengers and why messengers are so important. And the third session, as Vera said, will be a framing clinic where we can just, you can bring along your questions and queries and we can have a chat and I can have a look at them. So first thing I'm actually going to do is ask you to pop some stuff in the chat, really. And I always think this is a great way to start because probably some of you, like me, might come into this work with, you know, that sense of holding quite a lot and a sense of frustration of why are things not better when we know how to make things better and we just know what needs to be done. So I think it's really good to get some of that stuff off our chest, but it also gives us some real insight. It's the kind of first foundational step in the work that we do around framing and narratives is to identify what it is that people are saying and thinking about your issue that stops them from seeing what's true or real or rational or evidence, however you want to put it. What are the sorts of things they say? And yeah, I'm just have a either call out, we can do depending on what you're comfortable with, just unmute yourself or pop it into the chat and I can read it out. It's just always really helpful to kind of just whatever your issue is that you're working on. I might just stop sharing so that we can see everybody at this point. Yeah, Chrissy.
Hi. I just find it easier to talk than write.
Yeah.
Um, I guess for me, what's frustrating is in mine as a public health issue, or my experience was what I think is a public health issue. I've not really met anyone that I've told my story to that isn't shocked by what happened, but still not shocked enough for anything to tangibly improve, I guess. Part of the campaigning, and I never did anything like this before. I had my experience when I had my first baby, first and only baby. But I just remember thinking, my God, this is so wrong. Obviously, it's a big, terrible mistake. And when I tell people about this, they'll fix it. And that's when I started realizing about, you know, systemic issues in healthcare. And then I started deep diving into all of the bigger, wider issues that we have in our country that I've sort of ignored until, you know, something happened to me to take notice. But yeah, I guess, yeah, it's not that anyone isn't, you know, accepting that there's an issue with what I experienced, which was I became unwell with mental health problems after the birth of my child and was sectioned under the Mental Health Act when he was 3 weeks old and put in a psych ward, essentially, short story. And, you know, I spoke to the Herald and did an interview after talking at Parliament, and the mental health minister said, oh, it's so terrible and it's tragic and it's this and it's that. But obviously it's not terrible enough for, you know, people that make decisions to do anything about.
Yeah. So a sense that people care, but they don't seem to know or be motivated to actually do anything about it, is a really common thing. And sometimes we can tell really emotive stories which have great meaning to us personally, and put a lot into that, and people respond emotionally, but we don't seem to get the action. And that is definitely a very common thread that comes across. Like, if I can just give people the right information and fill them up, they'll know how to act. Why aren't they acting? Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one thing that comes through, and I'll talk about why that is in a bit as well, Chrissy. And I'm just going to read through some of the other great comments. Um, Abigail's just talking about finding it frustrating when it becomes a back and forth of data and facts. So same thing, like getting what I call a fact off, which is something I used to do a lot of. You get into, but this is true on a, this is true, but and you know, it just escalates into my facts are better than your facts, which, and again, we'll talk about why that is often not as effective as we think it should be. Colonial narratives of wilderness and human domination, yeah, and that's very common. So this idea that humans are above nature, and you know we can just kind of extract from it, and you know a big part of that is colonial systems of extraction and also them and us, right? Um, Anyone want to speak to anything that they, Patty, you've got your hand up.
I think one of the things I commonly hear whenever we run any campaigns is one, you'll always get the haters. That's kind of part out, the haters and the trolls. That just happens with any campaign. And people who are very good at misguiding people onto what isn't the issue. Or like our one was the issue with homelessness here, and we had a number of people who would go off on some other kaupapa about poverty. And it's like, well, we're on here to sign the petition. So there's always people that distract because that's their priority. But I think though it's this sense of apathy that kind of happens. I've had it a few times. One of the things we're trying to push up here is to get people to vote in the local councils and to get the Māori wards. But there is that sense of, and I know I had the same disagreement with my mother where um, we, I said, well, basically we have a system that is set against Māori in terms of voting. And I remember reading something from Mike Smith, and he was talking about all of the different barriers around how Māori can vote. And I get that a lot of things are systematically, legislation is created to stop Māori voting. So it's also about political will and political direction, which is another important thing, because with the petition, I know that this current government isn't going to listen. So the purpose of it is to really bring people on board to advocate for our local communities. But what I was hearing from my mother was a sense of apathy that people have, because they've been taught all their lives that they have no power.
Mm.
So it's actually restoring that power. Now my sister did it with me because as tangata whaikaha and tangata whaiora, both mental health and physical disability, we're told the stories of deficit. There's something wrong with us. So my sister said, share your story, but remember your mana and the mana that you stand on. So it is a thing that too, we're systematically told it doesn't work, can't fix it. There's something wrong with you, and you don't have any power, because it's often something that comes down from power. They want to remind us, but it's that narrative of how to change it around, but it's not. You've systematically got that the apathy is quite strong. Have you voted? It's today is the last day. Why haven't you voted? Oh yeah, I'll get around to it. Oh, I forgot. And it's that thing of all the education, all the preparation, but it takes will and it takes determination to do the work that needs to be done. And I hate to say it, all the data in the world does not change a government who has set agendas and directions.
Yeah.
Maybe this was a statement more than a question. Yeah.
But I think, Patty, what you're bringing up there, and I'll talk about this in a minute, are some really key ways that we have of thinking that develop through lived and real experience. The kind of apathy that you talk about is what we call a sense of fatalism, which is like no one will do anything, nothing will change. What's the point in doing anything? This has been my experience, and then there's also some, as you pointed out in there, there's some really strong, what we would call individualism narratives, which is like the problem is just on individuals to fix it, and not on the system, because people find it really hard when that particular combination of feeling fatalistic and that it's all on individuals. And I think for lots of you working on different issues and campaigns, these will be key. What I'm going to do now, and there's some great postings in there, so I'll keep referring back to them as we go. What I'm going to do now is show you some of the really common ways that we have of understanding what gets in the way. And you might recognize some of these. So these are some of the things that we most commonly see across any big issue that we work on come up. So we can't afford it in these times. The pipes need fixing. That's a nice to have. This is a common thing that we'll see in climate change, especially anything if we're doing any arts campaigning or advocacy, anything that's not considered, the basics. And of course, who gets to determine the basics is really an issue of power. Yeah, Kate.
Are you able to enter presentation mode? It's just the slides look really tiny on my screen. I'm not sure
Do
if
they? Okay, I will stop sharing and try that again. Thank you for letting me know that. Often people just kind of not say anything and then later it's like, okay, try this again. How is that better? Awesome.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. If that other group gets something, I lose out. So you will be really familiar with this, especially if we're doing anything around racism, anti-racism work, fertility work, welfare and benefit work. You will often hear, things that people say are like, well, I don't want them to get that because that means I'll get less. Never going to happen. No one will act on this. What's the point? That's the kind of stuff, Patty, you were talking about, that sense of there's just no point in doing this. People just need to try harder themselves or make better decisions as individuals. And yes, but our way is the better way, the superior way, the smarter way. These are just some of the most common things that we hear across issues. There are other things that come up, but what I want to show you is that these are associated with particular narratives, and these kind of meta narratives or frames, and I'll talk about frames, occur across all of our issues in our culture. And once we know them and we recognize them, as campaigners, it becomes a little bit easier for us to navigate around them, which is why I'm showing them to you. So when you might hear someone say, we can't afford it, or it's a luxury, or it's a nice to have, the cultural narrative that represents is one that we call scarcity. So that's the idea that there's not enough to go around. We can't have nice things. And here's a very small amount of things that we can have. Any kind of efficiency kind of conversation, like we need to cut budgets, and those budgets are usually cut in areas which would benefit people who have the least. There's a real power differential going on when we talk scarcity narratives. Anything where I don't want someone else to get something, kind of zero-sum game, that's kind of otherism or them and us. And that, obviously when wedges are used to divide people on the basis of race, so racist wedges are used, that's when we're using otherism. There's me and I belong in this group, and there's you and you're in that group. And if you get something, then somehow that's worse off for me. Fatalism, we talked about that, is just this idea that no one can act, no one will make any difference, especially people in politics who people have very low trust in or in institutions. no one will do anything. And that leads to a lot of disengagement, especially in political activism and the types of things that you actually need people to be more engaged in from Action Station's perspective. People just need to try harder or make better decisions. This is individualism, which I talked about, really strong narrative across Western culture. This idea that, you know, problems are caused by individual choices we make, and our solutions all rest in individual decisions. Climate change is a classic for this one. You can buy your way out of climate change, you know, that sort of thing. Poverty, we see lots of individualism going on in poverty as well. And you know, whenever anybody talks about, you know, there just being one way that's the smartest way, and obviously we're getting a lot of that around fertility and legislation at the moment, a lot of talk about there's one way that democracy should be done, and that's the kind of standard Western way. That's really a kind of Western exceptionalism, this idea that the way in which kind of especially colonial Western thinking has developed is the right way and the only way, and everything else is less. So those are some of the cultural narratives that are present. And when we know them, we can start to recognize them. And so much of what we do in framing and narratives is about pattern recognition. And when we can recognize these patterns coming up, we can actually do something about them and we can categorize them, and we can have a bit more of a standardized approach to them. So framing and narrative work is very much around recognizing patterns and having a kind of a much more strategic and tactical approach on the basis of those patterns that we see. What I'm going to talk about now is a little bit about framing in our storytelling minds and why it's such an important pillar when we're thinking about changing systems, especially. So at its most basic, framing is decisions that we make on how we present an issue to people. And I say decisions, but oftentimes we are just presenting issues to people through a frame without actually realizing it. So it's not necessarily an active decision that we're making. But just like the woman here is standing with a literal frame, what she'll be doing is she is presenting particular things inside of that frame. And there are a whole lot of things outside of that frame. So there are people outside of that frame, there are causes outside of the frames and solutions outside of the frame. And inside of the frame are very particular things that she's presenting. So that is how framing works, really. And what we know about framing is that the frames that we use affect how people think and reason. And it especially affects the information that they're ready to accept, or the likelihood that they will reject information. At their most basic, frames really are stories that exist in our minds, not only as individuals, but as collectives. So these frames exist at a kind of shared cultural level, and different cultures have different frames. But when we're dealing with mass communication in our current cultural environment, we're often dealing with kind of a Western dominated set of frames and ideas about how the world works. And these stories are really get programmed into our minds over our lives. If anyone has done any work with little babies or had little babies themselves, the way in which our brains develop, we learn these stories and rules. And you know, when they're very little, children get so rule bound, like they tell you what all the rules are, and that's because their brains are developing particular stories about how the world should work and what people's roles are in the world and who should be doing what and how a thing should or shouldn't be done. And those are all informed by all of those sources of information that are coming in at them. And this is a kind of a functional way which our brains develop, because it helps us move through the world more quickly. It helps us process information more quickly if we have pre-existing stories that we can apply to information as it gets in. Oh, this fits in with this story. This fits in with this story. I don't need to kind of reassess and re-understand why people are behaving this way. I've got it already pre-programmed in. So we think in frames. Everything we do, we think in frames. And actually we frame everything that we say, because that helps us understand each other. It's a cognitive linguistic aspect. So it's kind of programmed into our brains, and how we speak or communicate, if we use different types of communication, will activate or access different types of frames. And lots of people will use different terms for these. So I'm talking about frames and narratives and stories. Some people will call them sort of mental models or shared mindsets or schemas. But the important thing to know is that when I'm referring to them, I'm referring to these kind of ideas and stories that we have programmed into our brains, which are associated with particular ways that we communicate. What I'm showing you here is a duck, but I'm also showing you a picture of a rabbit. And now that I've told you that you can see both a duck and a rabbit, you will be able to create those pictures and see both of those, hopefully. And you'll move back and forth between them. And you won't see them both at the same time, but your brain can move between these different images that I have told you exist. And framing as an active process that we do works like this, is that we can frame things in different ways that move people between different frames that they have. Because the important thing about frames to know is people aren't particularly monolithic. Like they can think in lots of different ways and hold lots of different frames in their minds. Like we acquire lots of different ways of thinking about the world. And particular ways in which we as communicators, campaigners, activists frame things will bring or switch on a particular way of thinking on the world and switch off other ways of thinking about the world. And some of those will help people see the type of information that we're presenting to them, both our facts, but also the kind of solutions that we're presenting. And some of them will make it harder for people to see them and accept them and respond to them. I'm going to show you some videos now, a couple of videos. And these videos come from the UK, and they're street interviews with people about poverty. And what they show is two quite different ways that we have of thinking about poverty in our culture. So the first one I'm going to show you is a frame which people share, or an idea or story that people share about poverty, which is really common, which is this idea that we're somehow past poverty, and especially in Western countries like New Zealand or like the UK. So this is what that sounds like.
I don't think we have this rich, poor, no, as much as maybe what it was in the olden days.
I think we're just a more prosperous society, and I mean, people say we're poor, but they've got mobile phones and flat screen TVs and that sort of thing. I don't think they know the real sort of sense of the real word poverty.
In the general scheme of things, I don't think it compares to, you know, poverty in the rest of the world in quite the same sense.
So you can see there people are talking about poverty like it somehow doesn't exist in the UK, and or you know, you would have heard that woman say, well, people have mobile phones so they can't be poor. So then that's something you would probably recognize as well, like this idea that there are certain things associated with poverty, and if you have this thing, then somehow you're not poor. So that's one way in which people think about poverty. But there are other ways that people think about poverty. And so I'll show you the next video. This is a series of, again, people on the street being asked about poverty, and you can see that these people actually tell a different story about poverty and what causes it.
So I think it's about people not having opportunities.
Having no choices.
You know, not being able to live how you like or where you want.
They are just unfortunate enough to be born in a certain geographical location and have no to very little opportunity to access things that could help them escape the poverty cycle.
You have to be given the opportunities to be able to shine. If you live in a backwater, you've got no clubs, no social infrastructure for those kind of things, you ain't going to get on.
If you've little hope because you've little money and you've little aspirations because of those things, and because there seems no way out, your spirit is almost crushed.
So you can see there that people can think about poverty in quite different ways. They can think about some of the contexts, they can think about the stress that poverty causes and some of the psychological impacts. And the important thing to note is that framing is very much about trying to locate and find frames that are going to be more supportive of or more responsive to your issue and switching on those particular frames. I'm going to do a little exercise with you now to show you how that works. So I'm going to bring a word up on the screen, and in your chat, just write the first couple of words that come to mind or ideas that come to mind when you see this word. Okay.
So I think it's about.
So that word is consumer. Cool. Okay, I'm going to start reading so what you can see is pricing competition. Patty's got personal services. There's a few magazines that always comes up in New Zealand. Money, buy, want, stuff, customer service, people who buy things or use paid services, supermarket, corporate, capitalism, unit. So, okay, you can see there's some similar ideas coming up. Now I'm going to show you a different word and same thing. So that word is citizen. Again, Neil. Empowered, voting, any person, nationalism, rights, democracy, participant, community, everyone, person, rights for rights. Okay, so you can see again that there are some shared ways of thinking that come up with that word citizen. And I'm just going to show you something. If any of you grew up in the 80s with Alison Hulse, here's something that I prepared earlier, which is I do this with everybody who I talk to this stuff about. And these are really, you can see there are lots of really similar words and ideas and concepts that come up for both of these words, and you'll recognize your own in that. And that's because these two words in our culture are very powerful frames. Consumer is a very powerful frame that brings up ideas about how we interact with the world, what our role is, how problems are caused, failures of markets, how they should be solved, market correction. And citizen, the same. It has a very different story about the world and how we interact in it, what our role is, who is in and who is out. And this is what frames do. They tell us they frame a person, they frame an interaction, they frame a way of responding to the world, and they frame particular solutions and particular problems. And they leave a whole lot out of the frame, so that when the consumer frame is turned on, it's very hard to have people thinking about their actions as citizens. And likewise, when the citizen frame is turned on, outside of that frame is all of our interactions and behaviors and things as a consumer. And that's because that frames aren't just a communication tool, they exist as these neural pathways in our brains. So they are, and every time that frame is reinforced through hearing these ideas or seeing them more, that neural pathway grows stronger. So it becomes more normal, it's switched on more easily. So if you were to do brain imaging of when people seeing that word consumer, particular neural pathways would light up in people's brains because it's hardwired in there. And it's hardwired in there because, as I said earlier, it assists our decision making. But one of the things that's important to know from that is that therefore there will be particular frames that are not going to be that helpful for us telling a particular story. So, for example, in health and disability, we talk about consumer rights a lot. Now, that is using the consumer frame. And that means that what we're switching on for people is a story about the world in which we primarily act as buyers and purchasers of services. Now, in New Zealand's supposedly public health system, it is there for everyone. It's not there because we purchase it. It's not there because we pay tax or pay rates. It's there for children. It's there for people who come and need it. But when we frame rights within the health system as consumer rights, we're somehow implying that that only relates to people who have bought and paid for services, and it leaves out a whole lot of other people. Same happens in climate change quite a bit. So when we talk about a ratepayer or a taxpayer, then what we're framing in the climate change space is that the problems and solutions in climate change come primarily down to how we interact in the world as consumers. So for example, councils doing a lot of work at the moment around how do we respond to climate disruption. They want communities to come together and think about what does climate disruption mean for their local community and how might they plan for that. But they refer constantly to people as ratepayers and taxpayers. And what that means is that everybody who doesn't see themselves as that won't be engaged in a community action, but also they won't be able to see how coming together as a community and planning together as a community is relevant to their role as a taxpayer or a ratepayer. They'll see primarily that the council's role is to give them something for the tax or the rates that they've paid. Why should they be coming together on some sort of systemic solution in the community? So that's to say that, the way or the frames that we choose really need to match what the problems are, what the solutions and what the actions are that we want people to take. And using a frame that is going to encourage and help people see those is going to be really helpful. At that stage, sometimes people ask me, okay, well, that's all great, Jess. We can use frames and stories, but, why can't we just give people facts? If we've got good evidence and good facts, or if we've got perhaps a really compelling emotional story, which we talked about a little bit earlier, in which, we really engage people at an emotional level, why do we really need frames? And that's because of how people actually make decisions. So when I first came into this work, as I said, I have a special interest in facts, and I believe that if I could just fill people up with enough facts, then that's how they would act at that point. And when I say that out loud, of course, it doesn't seem to make that much sense. It's like, yeah, we kind of know that's not how people act. But the way in which we communicate is often built on that particular story or assumption that that's how people respond. So a lot of our communications are built or structured around this idea of filling people up with facts or giving them kind of emotional, personal stories. That how people actually make decisions is a little bit more complex than that. So the first thing is, and I listened to a podcast, actually. It was a podcast on meditation, and they were talking about our storytelling minds, and I just thought that was a lovely term, much better than talking about beliefs first, logic last, or the other way that I sometimes talk about it is I describe this as our fast thinking system. If any of you have ever read any of a guy called Daniel Kahneman's work, he talks about our two different systems of decision making, a fast thinking system and a slow thinking system. And essentially what I'm talking about here is our fast thinking system, which is in operation most of the time because it's very efficient, it's very resource, it doesn't take too much resource, and it assures that we can get through the world every day. So how that fast thinking system works is we get information or receive information, and we actually don't think, because it's happening very automatically. That information is first filtered through what we value and what we already believe. So those stories that we already have available to us and are easily available to us. And then what will happen is that those values and beliefs spark a response in us physically, and that's our feelings. So if any of you have ever been in that situation where somebody has said something that is just so out of line with your own values and beliefs, and you find yourself, physically having quite a physical response to it, and that's our nervous system doing its job. Our nervous system is saying, hey, what you've said doesn't fit with what I already value and believe. I'm giving you all of the signals that this isn't right. That nervous system response then wants to get itself back on an even keel. Our autonomic nervous system's job is to kind of keep us calm and steady. So what it will do then is, and this is where our minds and our bodies are just one system, they're not separate from each other, is that we make a decision in order about that information in order to keep our nervous system in a steady state. So that's when our decision kicks in, after our feelings. Then, because we are humans and because we like to think that we're rational, and it's important that we do use some information to back ourselves up, we will at that point use data and information to support the decision that we've already made. So there's a sort of backfilling of logic that happens. And this is where we use things, mental shortcuts. You might have heard of some of these sorts of things. We use cherry pick data is one of the more obvious ones, but sometimes just trust is a mental shortcut. Hey, look, here's a person who I trust who has said this thing that is not, in line with what you have said, and that makes me feel more comfortable because I've rejected your information. So that's what I'm going to draw on here. And when we know that this is how the system works, what we can see is why facts will not actually shift people when they've got a particular value set and belief, because facts and logic are coming last in that chain. I'll just show you a video, just a kind of a video I found on TikTok, which is a really good example of somebody using this fast thinking system. Okay, so
Which do you think are more dangerous, drag shows or guns to children?
Drag shows.
Drag shows. How many people do you think have been killed at a drag show?
I don't know, but the long-term effects are detrimental.
How many people do you think die every year from guns?
I have no idea.
48,000.
48,000? Yeah. Okay. Well, there's probably 100,000 that die from drag shows.
It's a big number dying from drag shows out there. And you can see how that person has a set of values and beliefs. Data isn't serving anything. They're doing something called defensive processing, which is they're protecting their beliefs. And then they're reaching for other data or making it out to find it. Now, yeah, you're right, Simeon. These videos are problematic videos in that they're created by people to try and make people look stupid. And I would never recommend this as a communication approach to try and convince people. It serves my purposes to show how fast thinking works. So yeah, people will defend what they believe and what they value. And this person obviously values the idea that drag shows, what they believe is that drag shows are doing some kind of erroneous harm. Now, clearly that is very wrong and it's based on all sorts of erroneous beliefs, but that fast thinking system is working, and a fact off is certainly not going to shift that person at all. So the question is, what will shift them?
Which do you think are
So this is where the framing bit comes in. So here what you can see is I've put the frame between the information and the values and the beliefs. And this is how framing works, is that if we can use framing strategically, then we can find a way to switch on those values and beliefs that are more helpful and more supportive of understanding our particular issues. And remember, I showed you those videos earlier about the 2 ways that people think about poverty. So I'm going to give you another 2 ways that people think about poverty, and this is from research that we've done. So one of them is individualism, and you'll recall I talked earlier about individualism being one of those core narratives and frames that we see in our culture. So this is really the idea that poverty is a problem of poor decision making, of individuals not trying hard enough. Well, there's another frame that people can access, which is that systems shape us. And you heard that in some of those interviews where people talked about people not being given the opportunities, or growing up in regions where there simply weren't the opportunities to have, to explore and have goals. And so people can think that systems do shape us and that bad policies lock people into poverty. Now, we can use either of those frames, and sometimes we inadvertently use the unhelpful frame. So sometimes, and this was work that I did some years back, campaigning for Every Child Counts, and which was about raising the benefit levels. Campaigners wanted to lift welfare levels, and the way that they went about it is that they talked about it not being children's fault. Now, inadvertently, that was an individualism frame. They didn't really realize it at the time. But what they were doing is saying, well, if it's not the children's fault, they were implying that it is someone's fault. And someone's fault would be the default values and beliefs that often come up about poverty, which is its parents' fault. It's bad decision making. That led to turning on values and beliefs about individual effort. It led to a discomfort in people's nervous systems about lifting welfare. No, that's not something we should do. And then, for example, in conversations I would have, people would support that no response by saying, well, I can think of somebody that if we lifted welfare and we took some of the restraints off it, they would just spend it irresponsibly. So they were using anecdote to support their decision. So we inadvertently switched on some unhelpful beliefs which undermined our own goals. However, when we use a different frame, and this is a frame that we've researched, and we talk about systems locking parents into poverty, then we access different values and beliefs that people hold. Values that people have about everyone should have a fair opportunity in life, that perhaps the government's role is to uplift, not punch down. There's a kind of a neutral response or maybe a comfortable response in people's nervous systems. They think, yeah, actually, maybe we could. And Action Station, in fact, did research, which at the time it showed, yes, people were supportive of raising welfare rates. The type of information, well, I trust this messenger. Yep, that supports my yes or my maybe. So we can see that the frame that we've put in to present the information is accessing different ways of thinking about the issues and making people a little bit more responsive. And why those values and beliefs are so important and working with them are so important in these narratives is because our world is constructed on these collective ideas. Many of you will know this instinctively, is that, the way in which we build our systems, who has power, what our relationships are like, what the policies get put in place, all of those things that we can see at the visible level, they're informed by this invisible stuff, which is values, beliefs, and culture. So any policy that you're working on or any area that you're working on will be based in part on values and beliefs. And when you're asking for a shift in a system, which many of you are working at, you have to be able to access values and beliefs that are going to be more supportive of shifting that system. So that's why we work with values and beliefs as a kind of core pillar of campaigning for big change or solutions. And the other thing, if you don't mind, I'll just finish this and then answer some questions in the chat. So the important thing to kind of understand in all of this as well is that decision makers are really like a balloon tied to this rock of public values and beliefs. Not always and not forever. When we see authoritarianism creep in, then decision makers are less inclined to listen to public values and beliefs. But in a functional democracy, which we still have to some degree, though there is obviously fears about that, decision makers will respond to their public, that rock. And for us as campaigners, as people who are interested in, shifting systems on the basis of people's needs, framing or using different frames in our campaigns is one way that we can shift that rock of public thinking. So if we can shift the rock of public thinking, then we can shift the decision makers. And they're more likely to, when we shift that public thinking, then changes that they make are more likely to stick as well. So for example, in tobacco policy, we've shifted the way in which our culture thinks about where we should smoke and who we should smoke around. So there's been a real shift in public thinking, which makes it harder, not impossible, mind you, given what the current government's doing, but harder for decision makers to shift policies back. So that's a little bit on the kind of the basics of that. And just to answer the question about how do people trust a messenger, is this where facts come in? Trust is a very innate thing that is built, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in messengers as well. And I'll take you through what some of the factors that build trust in messengers are. Often they can be, I see shared values or shared experience in my life is an important factor. Mistrust comes from I've had negative experiences, for example, with institutions that you represent. So trust is very much a culturally specific and experiential specific thing. But I'll spend a little bit longer on that in our second session. Okay, so I'm talking a lot. You're all doing well, folks. It's lunchtime. It's a warmer day. Just let me know if you need a break or anything. Because what I'm going to go on to now is what this actually means. So that's kind of the heavy stuff, the theory. And if you're a person who's just like, okay, Jess, great, just tell me what to do though, then we're going to move on to this. Okay, so what should we avoid? And I want to say this in a very respectful and open way, is these are all things which I have done. Until I kind of understood the work of framing and narratives, everything that I'm going to talk about around avoiding is stuff that I've engaged in over my career. So this is not about individuals. It's simply about the system that we exist in. So the first thing that we want to do is avoid telling their story. So by this, what I mean is that we don't want to use the opposition's frames and narratives in order to tell our own story or try and advocate for our own idea, because that switches on values and beliefs that are going to make it harder for people to respond positively to the real causes and solutions. And so when we use their frames and narratives, we access the types of values and beliefs and stories about the world that support their way of doing things. So what that might look like, I've got a couple of examples here. First of all, I'm using the poverty example case study throughout this presentation. They might say, so the opposition might say, well, parents should take some responsibility at some point. And you've probably heard various conservative politicians say this, or even just people in your community. It's not an untrue thing. It doesn't sound unreasonable, but what it's framing is this kind of individualism narrative, and it's framing this idea that poverty is caused by people making bad decisions, and namely parents. And then we say in response to that, well, it's not the children's fault. And, I talked about that earlier. So that's using their story, their individualism story, because what the public then thinks is, oh, but it is parents' fault and they should do better. So we're all just talking around the story in our minds. We're just turning on this frame that poverty is bad decisions and child poverty is definitely about the parents. And so we're all thinking and talking about that. That's their story. And what the public's not thinking about is this other idea that systems lock people into poverty. So we don't want to do that. And I've got another example from fertility work that we've done. And so, for example, the opposition story is the treaty is dividing us by race. That's what they say. And we respond to that by saying, there is a bit of division, but honouring the treaty will fix that. So we have now then reinforced the idea that division is present. And when we did focus groups with people, that was something that came up a lot, this idea that somehow we're an incredibly divided culture and society, which, by the way, is not true. But that's a story that the opposition like to tell because it serves their purposes. And so now what the public's thinking is, yes, so much division. Yes, we do just need to be one people. So they'll look to solutions that, for example, homogenize us or remove fertility or whatever other bad policy is being, racist policy is being suggested. And what they're not thinking about is this idea that the treaty fertility can help improve a lot of the things that I care about too, which is one of the things that we found is really important in our fertility work. So just a kind of a quick reminder, these are the things that we don't want to be using, the frames and narratives. We don't want to be using scarcity, otherism, fatalism, individualism, Western exceptionalism. Those are not our story. That's their story. This is just an example of when this happens. This is a case study. I don't know if any of you know this, but it was Shell and BP originally paid a PR firm called Ogilvy to come up with a way to talk about climate change that would take the focus off of systems and structural change. So they came up with the term carbon footprint. And so you can see, obviously, fossil fuel companies use it a lot, reducing carbon footprint, low carbon diet. And then inadvertently, other groups have picked that up. So even people who want systemic change in climate change will talk about individual carbon footprints or low carbon and kind of changes we can do individually. So that is a good example of what happens when we tell their story because we're not aware of the narratives and frames behind it. So number 2 thing that we want to avoid is leading with facts or ingredients. Those of you who are fans of the facts, like me, those aren't particularly engaging for people. They really matter for us. But as we saw earlier, when we lead with facts, we're not taking into account how people actually make decisions. And their ingredients is when we actually lead with the actual changes, the specifics and details of the changes that we want. And they aren't particularly engaging for people who are outside of this work or the campaigning. And I'll show you what that looks like. This was a campaign from Amnesty some years back around the refugee and migrant quota. And the actual ask was to double the quota. But this is what I would call the ingredients. So that's not the, when we think about when you go into a supermarket and you look at kind of those pre-packaged cake mixtures on the shelf, when they've got a picture of the cake, and that's what makes me want to buy that. They don't have a list of the ingredients on the back of it. And this is how ingredients-led campaigning works as well. For people who are outside of knowledge of the area or aren't already activated in this area, those ingredients aren't going to make people understand the issue or kind of engage in it. And likewise with facts, what happens when we do this sort of thing and just provide people with facts is that they will fill in the gaps because we have these storytelling minds and we want to understand why and who the characters in this story and how do we overcome this barrier, you know, if you think about a great piece of fiction. So can anybody kind of tell me, like, if you saw this and you didn't really understand structural drivers of poverty, what might you think has caused poverty? What would be the explanation that you gave for what had caused these kids to be in poverty?
Low-income households.
Yep, and who in those low-income households? Parents. Yeah, Lila's put in the chat, parents, right? That's where people are going to fill it in with those dominant narratives of individualism. I did have, when I asked this question once, I did have somebody say, and I said, what causes the poverty? And someone said rugby, which I really appreciated because as a New Zealander who doesn't appreciate rugby, I'm like, yes, this is an idea I can get behind. But anyway, so when we just lead with facts, we're not providing the story. We know the story, obviously, but other people are drawing on different stories. So they're going to fill it in. And that's why those fact offs are just going to lead you nowhere because people are going to protect the story, which they already hold. And finally, the third thing we want to avoid is repeating incorrect information to prove it's untrue. And this is classic myth busting. And that's because when we repeat an idea, it's a really powerful source of acquiring any information. That's how our brains work. The more we see something, the more normal it becomes, the easier it is to access. So we don't want to be responsible for repeating incorrect ideas. And it's a little bit, it's part of not telling your own story and just telling the opposition's story. But myth busting is a particular kind of technique that we'd like to use. And this is a study which was done recently with people who already backed climate science. They were given a whole lot of myth busting of from climate denialists, and they left the study now believing some of that false information. It's just the repetition and exposure to that false information created kind of a sense in their mind that maybe what they thought wasn't true. So we don't want to myth bust. And just to, as I said, we've all done it. This is my example of me doing it. So I did a lot of work in family wellbeing and poverty space some years back. I did a lot of opinion pieces because I'd done a lot of research to show that unconditional cash support was one of the best ways that we could improve outcomes for lots of our families. I knew that I knew that I was up against such a strong set of cultural stories about what caused poverty, that it would be really hard to get people to accept it. And I didn't understand framing at that point. So what I did instead, which is what we often do, is I myth bust some of the unhelpful ideas that I knew would get in the way. I could see there were unhelpful ways of thinking. So I told people those unhelpful ways of thinking weren't true. And what I've inadvertently done, of course, and reinforced both a deficit frame of people living on low incomes and an untrue piece of information, because actually what we know is that the people who spend the greatest proportion of their income on alcohol and tobacco are those people who earn the most. So it's actually diametrically opposed. But anyway, this is just to say that this was my kind of reactive communication response, and it was unhelpful. So it's all of us. And so my top tip there really is that the power of repetition and frames. Repeat only what you want people to think about. And I have a picture of an elephant here because George Lakoff, who's a cognitive linguist, often says, don't think of an elephant. And when I say don't think of an elephant, who is not thinking of an elephant at this point, right? So we don't put in people's minds the thing that you don't want them to think about, because the way our brains work is it will just create an image of that thing. Trying really hard to think about birds, nice ones. And this is just a little case study from the Every Child Counts campaign that was run in 2008 and 2009. And just Lisa's reflections that once they realized that framing needed to be a core pillar of their campaigning, it gave them a lot of answers as to why they were getting a lot of their campaigning was leading to a lot of attention. They were getting a lot of attention and conversation, but they weren't getting any shifts in the structures and systems. And that, we talked about that a little bit earlier, is that sometimes our campaigning and communications can bring us a lot of attention, bring a lot of emotion to the topic, but it doesn't achieve our goals. And what Lisa says about that now is that they realized that what they were doing were reinforcing some of those really unhelpful narratives about the causes of poverty, which meant they weren't going to get a shift in their particular ask. So it's important to know and to recognize that what your goal is for your campaign, and then think about what the frames are going to be that support your goal for the campaign. It's not just about bringing heat and light to an issue. It's about deepening people's understanding and turning on those beliefs and values that are helpful to your campaign goals. And I want to say that, we're often focused on two audience groups. We myth bust or we tell their story because we're often thinking about two particular audience groups. We're either thinking about those people who support us, who are in our base, and what they like and need to hear, or we're thinking about the opposition, the people who are really hard to persuade, and how we need to shut them down or respond to the kind of hurtful, harmful, erroneous, racist, untrue things that they say. But what we actually know is that on most issues, those two groups are in the minority. So this is work that we did this year on Te Tiriti and Māori culture, where we took a representative sample of New Zealanders. And what you can see in this graph is that you have a small opposition, that's about 3% of the population. If you add in the group in pink, it's about 18% of the population. Now, they are very loud, that is true, and very repugnant in the things that they say, but they're quite small. The base, you can see, is their strongest support, also small, but actually bigger. This work will be coming out quite soon. We're going to publicly release it soon, but so for now, we're just going to keep it within Action Station and people who are attending this, but we'll be able to share more of this really soon. Now, what you can see in the middle is what we call the movable middle. These are the people who, amazingly, have not made up their mind about these things, which I know when you work in an area, it's like, how can you not have made up your mind about this thing? But this is really what most of the population does. And what happens when we communicate just with the opposition, so we tell their stories or we myth bust their stories, or we think about what the base just wants to hear, then this large group in the middle are not getting the frames and the information that they need in order to convince them. And instead, they are likely to, because they are movable, if the opposition is using a great story, which they like, they're likely to move further towards the opposition. So our job is to give these folks tools, so your base, because not messages are only shared by those people who are already enthusiastic about your work, but we want to give them great framing tools because they will share anything, to be honest. So you don't want them to be sharing an unhelpful story or a myth bust. You want them to be using great frames to move these folks in the middle. And you want to keep an eye on these folks, but you don't want to build your stories around what they say. That's the kind of key takeaway when we're thinking about our audience. And when we do that, again, and this is information that's coming out soon, what we see is that it actually does connect that movable middle to our issue. So again, this is Te work. We used a frame with this movable middle, which was to help them, and this is Pākehā in the movable middle, to help them understand that Te is actually really relevant to their lives today. Because in our focus groups, what we heard from Pākehā is that maybe they thought about Te as an important historical document, maybe they didn't, but they really didn't see how it was relevant to their lives today. And we understood that actually we need Pākehā to know that it is relevant to their goals, their values, their aspirations as well, if we want them to fight for it. And so we used a frame where we positioned Te as the solution to big environmental problems and also problems in our economy and the way our economy was structured. And when we used that frame to talk about Te, we saw that there was a significant increase in their ability to see Te as relevant. So we can see that in kind of in these lab studies that a good frame will shift people. And then when we use them at scale in the wild, then it kind of escalates at scale really, and you can shift cultures on it. So I mean, I'm gonna come back to that question on Te in a bit because I just want to get through the material for today. So those are those things that we want to avoid. We want to avoid telling their story, and we want to avoid leading with facts and ingredients, and we want to avoid myth busting. So what do we want to, okay, great, Jess, those are things not to do. What should we do? So I'm going to move on now in the last 20 minutes and just cover two of the things that we want to do about telling your story. And then in our next session, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so what do we embrace? So tell your story, sell the cake that we want people to eat. And we always need to have an analysis of the problems and the solutions, but also your vision for the world. What is your vision for the world? Because so often what we're doing is we're fighting the opposition's vision for the world. We don't like that vision. We know it's a limited vision. We know that it will hurt people more, and we fight that, but we have to have a story to tell with our own vision and our own analysis. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to start talking finally, and Lizzie is going to put you into groups. And I just want you to spend 5 minutes. And this is something that you can do now for 5 minutes, but actually it's something that you can do together as campaigners later. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You're going to go into groups of 3. I don't know why I stopped sharing my screen because that actually tells you what we're going to do. And what I want you to just have a bit of a corridor about is what motivates you. What are the strengths of the people who are doing that work, and what does winning mean? So really just a kind of a broader conversation about what is your story that you want to tell. Yeah, Patty.
Just because I've only had 4 hours sleep, so I'm a little bit brain foggy today. Could you paste the questions into the chat, please?
I'm just about to do
Oh,
that.
sorry.
Oh,
I
no,
hadn't
no
even
problem, but it was a good reminder. Yeah. So while Lizzie fiddles around to put you into breakout groups, I am going to paste the questions into the chat, and hopefully they should also flow through to your breakout groups.
So I'm just going to pop you into rooms now. Some groups have 3 and some groups have 4. If you have any issues when you get in or can't join a room for any reason, just come back to the main room and I'll reallocate you. Okay, so I'll open those rooms. How long do you want
5
those rooms?
minutes. We'll just do a quick 5 minutes.
All right, cool. I'll pop you in there now. So you'll all automatically be reassigned and then come back.
Oh, yeah. Welcome back. No doubt many of you were cut off mid-sentence of something very important and meaningful. My apologies. I blame Zoom. How did you find that? What was the kind of, I think, first of all, just like, how did it feel to talk about that stuff?
I enjoyed the conversation, and although we all had different focuses, it was very interconnected what was priorities for us. But the one we kind of didn't understand was the strengths of the people. We weren't sure who you were referring to for the people.
Could be you, could be the people that you're working on behalf of in your communities. It's partly in a response, I guess, Patty, to that thing that what you brought up was there's so much deficit-led framing, right? And we around particular communities as well. And so it's always good to remind ourselves there's so much strengths in the people who we stand alongside in solidarity with and the people who we work with, and to kind of name that as part of our stories as well. Yeah.
Actually, that was one of the things we mentioned because Kate was about tax reform and oh my God, I'm sorry, Christy was talking
Christy.
about Christy, sorry, Christy. Christy was talking about how she had advocated in terms of better healthcare and to Minister Matt Ducey and how all of those conversations are very interconnected, but as well, I've begun to realize because I'm very much a reactive type of personality to the trolls, but I've realized that positive framework and bringing in those who are middling, the people who are not kind of getting in on the cope is quite important. But yeah, I suppose I just have issues with the misinformation because there's quite a lot of it, quite a lot of it.
Yeah, and we do a whole different training on that. But this is the important, it's good to know that this is the important foundation stone, even when you're dealing with misinformation. Understanding framing and narratives is still a really important kind of building block. So I have been incredibly optimistic about what we could get through today. So what I'm going to do is just share, and then I have rapidly updated what our next session will actually involve on that basis. So I am going to share again and put on present view. Right. Okay. So this is again a little bit of a kind of a pre-prepared cake for you. These are some of the powerful narratives and frames that we find across our work helps support justice, inclusion, and what I would call radical evidence, because actually evidence is increasingly radical in this day and age. So, and I'm going to show you some examples of what they look like in campaigns or communications. Systems shape and context shape us, and that we can reshape those systems and context. Really important for getting people to lift their view. We're stronger together. So if people are using a narrative of division and them and us, then framing around messages of solidarity and our strength and togetherness, whether that's across ethnicity or across class or across different groups. There is a better life, and it is possible to overcome some of those fatalistic frames. Our differences make us and help us solve problems. If people are going to try and homogenize everything in all of our systems and our people and make difference a bad thing, we can talk about difference and the critical importance that diversity plays in helping us solve problems. Again, if people are going to use deficit-led frames, which they often do when we're thinking about, work and poverty or in different community groups, then we can talk about the strengths. And then, for example, a lot of the work that I do in the space of poverty is to talk about the enormous grit and determination which people living on low incomes have. And a really strong one is we need to be free to decide for our communities. So that's this idea that if industry or particular bad faith players are controlling us or restricting us, then self-determination is really important. And I'll show you what that looks like in a campaign as well. So if we were to tell our story about the creative industries, we might go from art is not a nice to have, it's important work, to telling our story, which is prioritizing creativity and imagination is how we create better lives for all of us. So that's our story, because we know that creativity and arts and culture is fundamental to who we are as humans and it helps us thrive. That's our story that we want to tell. This is a video that I'm going to show you from the Irish campaign for equal marriage votes. And this is a great example of telling your own story, which is based on kind of that we're better and stronger together, actually, is partly what it's based on. So I'll show you that. Always just like to take a moment. It makes me feel warm inside. And that's a lovely story framing what solidarity looks like and what an issue which was seen as being only or treated as being over there and only relevant to those people over there is to bring it closer and say this is actually about all of us and this is about the types of lives that we can live in our community together. So another example I will move through. So that's Māori Wards campaign, which you would have seen. Again, that's drawing on this frame and this story of we're stronger together. Is through Māori Wards, we actually get better decision making for all of us and for the types of outcomes that many of us care about. And I'm going to, this is actually an example that I've taken from Australia. So I've tried to do a few different examples. It's a bit small, but you can, I'll explain it to you. This is really about explaining how creativity can create a better life. And this is an example of the use of creativity in youth justice diversion. And because typically sometimes when we talk about arts and culture and creativity, it can be quite siloed into, well, it only applies to this group of people over here. And this is a great frame to talk about how fundamental creativity is to many people's lives, but also to kind of connection in our communities and to solving problems like dissociation from our culture and our community that can lead to some issues. So this is a good example of a better life narrative. I was talking earlier about we all have strengths in poverty, and one of the things that we often see is a real deficit frame applied to people on low incomes. This is flipping that on its head and saying, look, people who are on low incomes are incredibly hardworking in lots of different ways, you know, whether they are in work or out of work, you know, there's so many ways through which the grit and determination of people on low incomes needs to be seen and valued. So that's that we all have strengths. And then, oh, actually, I've put this slide in the wrong place. I talked a little bit earlier about we need to be free to decide for ourselves. And so this is an example of that narrative being applied. This is a US campaign, but it's around the tobacco industry. So any of the harm industries, if you're ever doing any work with the harm industries, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, this can be a really powerful frame because of the way in which they really limit and constrain that they get involved in our communities, they get everywhere, they manipulate us through advertising or through whatever. So this kind of broader narrative around self-determination. And here you've got two examples. One's young people talking about they're going to be the generation that ends smoking because that's something they want for themselves. And then there's a little bit more of a specific campaign, which was about how big tobacco is targeting low income and black neighborhoods and just naming that and using that particular frame. Okay, so we are bang on the time now. So, and I have quickly changed what we're going to do next session. So next session, we are going to move on to how we use values and the story structure and messengers for that. And I have not left much time for questions, but if any of you want to stay on, I've got a few more minutes. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes to just answer any questions. I'm just going to stop sharing.
When is that treaty work coming out? And
yeah. So we partnered with Tokona Taraki on that, you know, and we're just waiting for them to give the go ahead. So it should be sometime in the next month. In the meantime, there is a document on our website from the first part of the research where we did focus groups and talked to Pākehā about Te Tiriti, which has some advice in it as well.
Thank you.
One question is, I suppose this is around when I've put up pānui on public Facebook pages, I've often gotten the trolls. Now I've noticed that a lot of this was for our disabled community here when we had the hikoi come through whāngarei. And we had a few, one guy who was going on about English is the only language spoken in New Zealand, which we all know is not a factual statement. There's multiple languages in New Zealand. But I didn't engage, and I realized maybe I should have twisted it to reframe it in a positive way, and really unsure how I could have done that. In the end, I said, well, I need to get on with the work of organising this kaupapa for our disability community, so I don't have time to engage with this. But everyone else who was in the disability community started going at him on the Facebook page, and then he sent a private message claiming I was a pedo.
Yeah, so
yeah.
I think that kind of relates to another question I can see in the chat about obvious bad faith. I think some people ask bad faith questions and they're bad faith questions, Patty, and I just think it's not worth engaging with that. I think if you really feel like you need to say something, then next week we'll talk about values framing and talking about how we can lead by stating what our values are in response to those kinds of questions. But in general, I would say you're doing a lot of work. There's so much resource and energy that you're having to apply. Do not feel that you need to then respond to bad faith people in social media. It just drains you, right? And it's not going to give you the impact that you want.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
So I've got there's a couple more questions. I might just go to yours, Abigail. How do we deal with lack of discipline within our movements? Yeah, it's tricky, right? It's really, really tricky. These sorts of sessions where we talk about how to do messaging is one way that we can do it. I think just recognizing that there's a lot of nervous system overaction and overreaction going on for people, especially if people have had negative experiences. I've been doing this work for 10 years and it still drives me a little bit nutty how reactive people are and how that feeds the algorithms, and I want them to be better, but just telling them to be better isn't going to do it. So I think gently, right? Share this stuff where you can, lead by example, show values-based framing, which we'll do next week, talk about the importance of keeping your own nervous system calm, and taking a pause. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that amazing answer. It's brilliant.
Cool. I might just end it there for everybody because I don't want everyone to miss out on things, but also keep your questions as well for the third session as well, so we can use that third clinic session for more questions as well. All right. It's lovely to see you, everyone, and thanks so much for engaging.